Everyone, this is just a quick video to go over the last topic, the Good Friday Agreement. This unit, Northern Ireland in particular, but the entirety of Year 11 for GCSE history is quite rushed, and this at least provides you with an opportunity to, even outside of class, go onto Google Classroom and get access to the information. A version of my teaching, even though you are in the classroom, which you can use to help you ahead of your exam in May. For those watching in 2026, you will know that this question was assessed in the 2025, or this topic was assessed in the 2025 summer paper for reactions to the Good Friday Agreement. That means reactions to the Good Friday Agreement will not come up in the 2026 summer paper as a 9 marker, but they could still come up as a source-based question. Question 1 or 2 where you take a quote and use your knowledge, or questions on reliability or utility, in which case you're going to need to know specific knowledge. It could also come up as a 1 or 2 marker, and it'd be a shame to throw away marks there. So you still need to know reactions, just not in the detail that you would have last year because the question has already been assessed. It could still come up as a 9 marker in the 2026 paper on things such as the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. Basically just talk about what was in the agreement. But we'll get into all that as we move along. You can see videos are going to come up as we go throughout this. I will just point out that the videos won't play, but you can find them by downloading the PowerPoints on the Google Classroom app and actually playing the PowerPoint. Viewing it on the website itself won't actually show you the video, but you can of course search for the videos online if you think they're of any use to you. I will also point out that I'm recording this slide by slide, so there may be some variations in the levels of audio in between each slide, but just be mindful of that. So these are the 3 areas you need to know with regards to the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement. You need to describe the steps towards it, or in other words, the reasons the Good Friday Agreement came about. Then you normally talk about events. In this case, it's terms. What are the terms of the Good Friday Agreement? What information does the Good Friday Agreement actually have within it? So just what was agreed is essentially that. And the last one again is reactions to the Good Friday Agreement. That will not come up as an 9 marker in 2026. But it could come up in some other capacity. If this topic does come up, it's unlikely, but if it does come up, it'll be describe the reasons for the steps toward the Good Friday Agreement, or describe the key terms of it. I don't think either of those is likely, but if one was more likely than the other, I would myself err towards the first one, the steps towards the Good Friday Agreement, the reasons why it came about. That's a nice question, and that would be a really good one to get in the bag if it came up on your exam by just knowing it. So a bit of context here then on the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday, or sometimes the Belfast Agreement, was a peace settlement. So it was an agreement to reach a peaceful settlement and end to the conflict which had been going on in Northern Ireland since the 1960s. It ended the 30 years of conflict. So we're talking around 68, 69 up until 1998 when it was signed. And it was negotiated by 3 main groups: the British government, led by Tony Blair, the Irish government, led by Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, and the political parties of Northern Ireland. So that's your DUP, Sinn Féin, SDLP, UUP, Alliance, etc. They're the 3 groups that came together to reach this agreement, and they all had to agree between the 3 of them what the final agreement would look like. And that is obviously a big, tricky task. It was ratified, which just means it was confirmed or approved or agreed to by the people of Ireland in a referendum. More so the people of Northern Ireland, but there is an aspect of it which had to have a vote in the Republic of Ireland, but I'll explain that later. I should also point out, it's very easy looking back to think, oh well, it was going to happen by that point in time. Not necessarily. In fact, the agreement itself missed its own deadline by a few hours. It seemed at one point that the entire thing was going to be a loss, just like previous attempts to find peace in Northern Ireland. So it's a credit to the people who actually got this agreement across the line that it was successful in getting approved. Now, in terms of reasons for the Good Friday Agreement, or as it's put here, steps to the Good Friday Agreement, the first big step is the 1994 ceasefires. Without this, beginning the ball rolling towards peace and the advancement of a peace process, there would never have been a Good Friday Agreement. So this is one of the big reasons why the Good Friday Agreement comes about. As you should know, on the 31st of August 1994, the Provisional IRA announced a ceasefire. On the 13th of October that year, loyalist paramilitary groups also announced a ceasefire. So these ceasefires ended tension between communities, or not ended, rather eased. There's still tension there, but when there's no armed paramilitary organizations from both sides to fear, or rather, not that there's none, but when they've called off their active campaign, you don't have to be as worried about them. It makes it easier to actually reach agreement, because there's a sense here loyalists can trust nationalists because the IRA has taken a step back. Nationalists can trust loyalists because they've signalled their intent for peace by having their paramilitary stepping back. So it does ease the tensions, which makes it more likely. It improves the relations and trust between communities, which allows the political parties that represent both communities to actually reach a deal. If the IRA was still bombing, if loyalist paramilitaries were still shooting, then there's not going to be any hunger to want to work together. But the fact that both have gone on ceasefire, that makes it easier to work together, and that's a big step in this step towards the Good Friday Agreement. I will say, although the IRA ceasefire collapsed in 1996, the IRA had already shown that it was willing to end conflict if the conditions were right. So it was a big step, and the IRA does, as you'll later see, come up with its own variation, or sorry, its own renewed ceasefire. The next big one in the step towards the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 is the framework documents. In February 1995, the British and Irish governments drew up what was called the framework documents. So this was agreed between the two governments. And these documents set the agenda for peace talks. So they basically came out with, this is what the framework of what a peace settlement would look like. These are the types of things we would be talking about. For example, they proposed a Northern Ireland Assembly, like we've seen with the Power Sharing Assembly of 1974. And they also had a North-South Council of Ministers, kind of similar to the Sunningdale Agreement. So they said, this is what will be on the table, this is what we'll be hammering out and agreeing between ourselves, this is what will be up for. The next big step then is David Trimble. So in September 1995, this man on the right of your screen, David Trimble, was elected as the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party. Okay, that's the party that had been the big unionist party in Northern Ireland since 1920s. That's the party of Terence O'Neill and Brian Faulkner. And David Trimble's election as UUP leader is a really significant step towards the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. Trimble publicly declared support for the peace process. So the leader of the biggest unionist party has come out and said that he is in favour of a peace process. That adds weight to the peace process. That, he's persuading in that moment unionists to come with him on this search for peace. The biggest unionist party in Northern Ireland is openly committed to reaching a peaceful settlement. That makes it more likely. If they've been against it, if the UUP had been against a peace settlement, it wouldn't have happened. Okay, you can't have a peace settlement without the support of the biggest party of one of the groups involved, unionists. So that is a massive step towards the Good Friday Agreement when he's elected in September 1995. The next big step then towards the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 is the Mitchell Principles. These were announced by a name you should know already, US Senator George Mitchell, who was the United States Special Envoy to Northern Ireland. In January 1996, Senator Mitchell issued his Mitchell Principles of Non-Violence, to give them their full name. And these were 6 ground rules that determined whether a political party could take part in the peace talks. So really this is aimed towards the more extreme parties, particularly this is really aimed towards Sinn Féin, who, as you know, is the political wing of the Provisional IRA. In these principles, there was commitments on decommission and electoral politics. Essentially, those who were taking part had to commit to using electoral politics and to, agreeing to the decommissioning of weapons used by paramilitary organisations. Sinn Féin agreed to these, and as a result, they were then allowed to be included in peace talks. The IRA, on the other hand, does not really consent, mainly because of the idea of decommissioning. The IRA doesn't want to give up its guns until it has something concrete that it can rely upon and prove to them what the future is going to look like. But these Mitchell Principles are a massive step. I mean, these are all massive steps towards the Good Friday Agreement, but by setting out clear rules for which parties can and cannot take part in the peace talks, Mitchell is essentially giving Sinn Féin an opportunity. if you want to be part of the peace process, and to be honest, they need to be part. They represent, they're the biggest Republican party, not the biggest nationalist party. That would be the SDLP. But in terms of more hardline, willing to use violence, Republicans, Sinn Féin is the party, and they're quite a significant. They're the second biggest party in nationalist politics at this point in time, and without them, the agreement would probably fail. So Mitchell's given them an opportunity to enter these talks in a way that would be acceptable, and that helps to bring about the Good Friday Agreement because it allows for Sinn Féin to be included. The next big step towards the Good Friday Agreement is something called the Northern Ireland Forum. A forum is essentially a place where you can go for discussions. We have things like online forums where people go and have conversations online. The biggest example I can think of a forum would be something like Reddit, which is a website for people to go and have little discussions, little forums in areas set up dedicated to unique things. In the case of the Northern Ireland Forum, it was a sort of body. It wasn't an assembly, I'll come to that in a second, but it was essentially a place where people could go and politicians really, could go and discuss the peace process. So in June 1996, elections were held to the new Northern Ireland Forum. This, as I said, was not an assembly. It had no powers. It was essentially a group of seats for politicians who would be voted to come into that area and have discussions and debates and try and find areas of agreement between them with regards to the peace process. So it's simply a space to debate issues relevant to peace negotiations. Political parties only could stand, they had to stand and they had to win votes, and then they could have conversations in this forum, debates in this forum, which would help to move the conversation on the peace process along. But it didn't have any official powers. Okay, that is the next big step in that Northern Ireland Forum. So the next big step, it would be the 1997 British general election. In 1997, John Major's Conservative government, the Tories, that British government was replaced. The voters removed them from power and instead elected in May 1997 Tony Blair as Prime Minister. He was the leader of the Labour Party. So the Labour Party has once again entered power in Britain in 1997. And that's a big step towards the Good Friday Agreement. Blair announced that Sinn Féin would be allowed to enter talks if the IRA renewed their ceasefire. That's really important. So earlier on we were talking about the 1994 ceasefires. In 1996 the IRA called off their ceasefire. They ended it. By 1997, Tony Blair has basically thrown the gauntlet down to Sinn Féin. He's basically said to them, the ball's in your court. You can come back into these talks, but the IRA needs to renew their ceasefire. That is important because it gives Sinn Féin the opportunity then to hush the IRA, ask them to step back, and then allow them to have a role in these talks with regards to what the peace process will look like. As you can see here, it says, and this is really important, Sinn Féin also won 2 seats in Parliament. So Gerry Adams regained his seat of Belfast West, which he had lost in 1992 to the SDLP. And Gerry Adams' second-hand man, Mark McGuinness, won the seat of Mid-Ulster. It's not really important if you can't remember the seats, but you can say that Sinn Féin won 2 seats in Parliament, Gerry Adams and Mark McGuinness. Then that's important because that reminds Sinn Féin of the benefits of electoral politics. We've discussed in the past how Republicans throughout the 1980s after the hunger strike began to move away from just using the Armalite weapons and towards the Armalite and the ballot box. Weapons in one hand, the ballot box electoral politics in the other hand. And this great victory for Sinn Féin in 1987, where they win 2 seats, is really important in reminding them there is something in using elections, there is something in using politics and not political violence. And that helps them to further commit them to peaceful politics, which encourages them to continue with these peace negotiations. So that 1997 British general election is very important in the peace process that follows. I specifically mentioned Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister. This is him at the centre of the screen. Just this is him the day after he'd been elected, walking towards the steps of Downing Street to enter number 10 for the first time as Prime Minister. However, it's not just the election of Blair in 1997 in Britain, which helps the peace process. It's also the election of another politician in the Republic, and that is this man here on the right-hand side of your screen. That is the new Taoiseach in 1997, Bertie Ahern. So in June 1997, a month after the British general election, the same thing happens in the Republic of Ireland. The Irish government of the time is removed by its voters, and a new government is elected in their Irish general election in June, the following month after the British general election. Fianna Fáil, led by new Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, made a coalition government with the Progressive Democrats. You don't really need that detail. What you just need to know is that in June 1997, the Irish government was removed and replaced by a new government led by Bertie Ahern, and he, like Blair, was very much committed to finding a peace settlement in Northern Ireland. And that's useful because now the British and the Irish governments had the same goals. They were on the same page. And if you have London and Dublin, the British and Irish governments working together on one agreed goal, that makes it much easier then to try and persuade the political parties and the people of Northern Ireland to pursue that goal and to follow that goal. So you have both different governments in London and Dublin singing from the same hymn sheet, and that makes it very, not very easy, but it makes it much easier than if one government was against the peace process. So this really helps to shore up the steps towards this final Good Friday Agreement eventually in 1998. The next big step then towards the Good Friday Agreement is the IRA's renewed ceasefire in 1997. So we've talked already about this twice. The IRA ceasefire, the initial one announced in 1994, ends in February 1996. The IRA was unhappy with the direction talks were taken, and so they took the decision to end their ceasefire, announcing a public statement that that would be the case. And 1 hour later, they planted a bomb in the London Docklands area, is what we're going to go with. It's not necessarily 100% true, but that's what CCEA go with. So they plant the bomb in the London Docklands, and that ends their initial ceasefire. However, as you know, in May 1997, Tony Blair, the new British Prime Minister, said Sinn Féin could enter into the peace negotiations if they could convince the IRA to renew their ceasefire. And the IRA do. In July 1997, the IRA once again announces a ceasefire. They renew their initial ceasefire from 1994, and they're going to stop using political violence. That means Sinn Féin can be entered into talks. However, of course, the DUP, led by Ian Paisley, is not going to be happy about that, and they weren't. And the DUP, along with the UKUP, the United Kingdom Unionist Party, both pull out of the peace talks because Sinn Féin has been admitted. Paisley would have referred to Sinn Féin as being Sinn Féin IRA because of how closely connected the two organisations were. Many have actually, as I'll allude to later in greater detail, referred to the DUP and Paisley as the abominable no men. That's political commentators have said that because of how often they said no to talks, and in this case in 1997 when they leave the talks, it is because of Sinn Féin being admitted in. However, David Trimble and the UUP, the Ulster Unionist Party, the largest unionist party in Northern Ireland, they remained committed to the peace talks, and as such it helped the talks to continue. Now you've got the biggest Republican Party in terms of Sinn Féin, the more hardline nationalist parties, the Republicans. You have that party involved. You have the biggest nationalist party, the SDLP, involved, and you have the biggest unionist party, the UUP, involved. And that helps to push these negotiations forward because, as we know, Sinn Féin was and is the political wing of the provisional IRA. If you want the peace process in Northern Ireland, you need to eventually convince the IRA to end their campaign, and including Sinn Féin and making Sinn Féin agree to any peace agreement is a big step in ensuring that peace process lasts and that it is a successful peace process. This does cause dismay, though, amongst some Republicans, and in November 1997, Republicans actually became split over the IRA's commitment to the peace process. Many thought that the IRA should not be committing to a peace process. They thought the IRA should continue to use its campaign of what it called armed struggle, its campaign of political violence, to win a united Ireland and to force the British to leave via force. And this leads to a split in the IRA, quite similar to the split that we saw in 1969 that gave birth to the Provisional IRA. Some Republicans split to form two groups: the Continuity IRA and also the Real IRA. Okay. Another significant step towards the Good Friday Agreement, and one that is often overlooked, is the appointment of Mo Mowlam as the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. That is, of course, as you remember, from direct rule, that is the British Cabinet Minister responsible for overseeing Northern Ireland. Okay, and when New Labour, or the Labour Party, win the 1997 general election in Britain, led by Tony Blair, Blair makes a decision to appoint Mo Mowlam as his new Labour Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Mowlam's approach really deserves credit. It was very fresh and it was blunt. She didn't mince her words. She was very clear on what she wanted, and she was very blunt with the politicians she was dealing with. In one particular point where we see her effectiveness is in January 1998. So a couple of months before the Good Friday Agreement is actually agreed. But she took a political gamble, and she actually went to the maze, the H blocks, and met with loyalist prisoners who had actually voted to end support for the peace process. And she talks with these loyalists who decided that they were not going to take part in the peace process, and she persuades them to continue to support it. And that really shores up support for this Good Friday Agreement and keeps the many loyalist people in the H blocks, in Her Majesty's Maze, the prison, on side. And it really helps to just keep the ball rolling and keep momentum moving towards this eventual peace agreement, which is later going to be agreed upon in mid-1998. The last significant step then towards the Good Friday Agreement of April 1998 is a deadline set by US Senator George Mitchell. So George Mitchell was actually the chairman of the peace talks that were taking place in Northern Ireland. So yes, the British and Irish governments are involved to a great extent. Yes, of course, the Northern Ireland political parties are involved, but they take this separate figure, this United States senator, who has been appointed a special envoy by the president, Bill Clinton, and they use him as a sort of neutral figure to chair the talks. And he was really pressuring politicians to work together. And one of the ways that George Mitchell does this is by setting a deadline, 9th of April 1998. So George Mitchell states there must be an agreement in place by 1998. Otherwise the talks are done and that's it. This was all for nothing. And it was hoped that by creating this deadline, it would force parties to reach an agreement, that there couldn't be any dithering or delaying, that they would have to keep working to try and meet that deadline. Otherwise the whole thing would have been a failure and for nothing. Having just talked about George Mitchell's deadline, it's worth pointing out that as often is the way in Northern Ireland, the deadline is missed. The deadline of the 9th of April was set, but the deadline of the 9th of April was not actually met. Instead, on the 10th of April 1998, in the early hours of the morning, the British and the Irish governments, along with most of the political parties from Northern Ireland, managed eventually to sign what is officially called the Belfast Agreement, but is more widely known as the Good Friday Agreement. It's signed and agreed on Good Friday, which is why it has that date, or why it has that title rather, of the Good Friday Agreement, because of the day that it was agreed upon. You can actually see a copy of the Good Friday Agreement on the right hand side of the screen. This was a book that was produced and sent to every single household in Northern Ireland, and you can see it says there, this agreement is about your future. Please read it carefully. It's your decision. So each household was given at least one copy of this to read, to look at the agreement, to see what had been agreed by the Unionist parties, the Nationalist parties, the Republican and Loyalist parties, the British and Irish governments, to see what was actually going to be put before them. And every single person over the age of 18 in Northern Ireland would then be given a vote as to whether or not they would accept this agreement. Just another quick photo here then you can have a look at is the actual front page of the agreement itself. The Belfast Agreement, an agreement reached on the multi-party talks on Northern Ireland. You can see all the different signatures around it. You can see David Trimble right there in the middle. underneath the British government's crest. Just to the left, you can see Tony Blair. You can see other big names that were involved around it, such as Bertie Ahern, just under Tony Blair. You can see people like David Irvine, Gusty Spence. You can also see Mo Mowlam. You can see Jerry Adams and people like that. So all the big political figures signed this page with their name on it, just showing how they all came together to agree this peace settlement. Now we're into the actual terms of the agreement. So that was all the reasons the agreement came about and eventually when it was signed. In terms of the terms, this is just, you think of terms and conditions, what is actually in it. This is just what does it say, what was agreed, and this could potentially be a name marker in and of itself. It's important to say the agreement has three strands, not stands as it says on the screen. Essentially it has three main areas that it talks about where there's agreement been reached. The first is internal affairs in Northern Ireland. Internal just meaning inside Northern Ireland. So devolved government, essentially what will government look like in Northern Ireland post this agreement? You know, the assembly, the executive, quite similar to the power sharing that we saw in 1974. The second area is north-south relations. So just what will relations look like between the government of Northern Ireland and the government of the Republic of Ireland? Okay, and the final area is east-west links. This is relations between the entire island of Ireland and the island of Britain. I think the three strands are best understood when you can actually visualize them. So you can see I've got a map on the screen of Britain and Ireland. You can see in terms of Ireland itself, you've got Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. In terms of Britain, you've got Wales, England, and Scotland. And the first one, that internal affairs in Northern Ireland, what the Northern Ireland government will look like, it just affects Northern Ireland. It's just what will the Assembly and the Executive, the government and the Parliament of Northern Ireland look like, or the Assembly, not Parliament. The second one, strand 2, you can see here the red circle, is the entirety of the island of Ireland. How are the two governments, north and south, going to actually work together? What bodies will be put up to help them agree to work together on important issues? And strand 3 covers both islands entirely. How the governments of Scotland, England and Wales will interact with the governments of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So strand 1 then, as I've already alluded to, talks about internal affairs in Northern Ireland, just focusing on how Northern Ireland is going to be governed. And it outlined, as you can see, the type of devolved government Northern Ireland would have. So what they agree is, and what you need to know, there is going to be a new Northern Ireland Assembly. And it's very similar to the Power Sharing Assembly that was set up in 1974. Remember, an assembly is basically the big room where politicians come together to vote on laws. It's not the government itself, they just pass laws and vote for and against laws. The assembly is going to have, or rather did at the time have, 108 members, and they were known as members of the Legislative Assembly, or MLAs for short. That's quite like how in Britain, in the British Parliament, you have members of Parliament known as MPs. So members of the Legislative Assembly, MLAs, are just people who've been voted by local areas in Northern Ireland to go to Stormont and vote for laws on their behalf. It's important again to point out that they're using proportional representation. This was the type of elections that took place to the Northern Ireland Assembly back in 1974. Why proportional representation is useful for Northern Ireland is that it prevents any single party getting a majority, getting more than 50% plus one of the votes. And this means that different political parties will be forced to work together. Nationalist and Unionist will be forced to work together. None of them will have more than half the seats and therefore be able to govern by themselves. So this makes sure that everyone has an accurate reflection of how people have voted. If Sinn Féin get 10% of the votes, they get 10% of the seats. If the DUP get 13% of the vote, they get 13% of the seats. No one ends up with a really overinflated 50% of the seats when they don't deserve it. And that's good for forcing the two communities to work together. Down at the bottom you can see it says important issues would require something called parallel consent. And if you think of parallel lines like you'll see in maths. It's two lines that run alongside each other. And that's why they've taken that word. Parallel consent means on really important issues, you must have a majority of nationalist MLAs agreeing to it, voting yes, and a majority of unionist MLAs agreeing to it, voting yes. So if it's a really important issue and you don't have the support of more than half, 50% plus one of nationalists, then the agreement doesn't count. If you don't have the support of the majority of unionists, 50% plus one, then the agreement doesn't count. You have to have more than 50% of nationalists and unionists only for really important issues, not for normal laws, but for really important divisive issues. You need parallel consent. So parallel, both communities working together, going in the same direction in agreement, more than half, like parallel lines. That's where that comes from. Strand 2 is nice and easy to remember. It's nice and short and sweet. It again is focused on the island of Ireland, relations between the north and the south, north-south links. And what it sets up is a new north-south ministerial council. Very much what it sounds like. A council, an area where ministers from the southern government and the northern government can come together to work together. Ministers from the new Northern Ireland Executive, that's the new Northern Ireland government, and the Irish government would meet to discuss relevant issues for both countries. So they would cooperate on shared issues, for example, tourism and health. So they will work on issues where they can both work together to benefit both countries. It's very similar to that council we saw agreed at Sunnydale in 1974, but this time it's very clear what the role of it, and it has support from the UUP and the SDLP as the two biggest nationalist and unionist parties. So Strand 2 was north-south, and the north-south ministerial council. Strand 3 is east and west. It's British and Irish. So it creates a new British-Irish council, which you can see here, the logo for it on the bottom right of your screen. It's created to promote links between countries in the British Isles. So just all the countries on the island of Britain and all the countries on the island of Ireland. It would have representatives from the British and Irish governments, so that's the London government and Dublin government, along with the devolved institutions in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. So it's just an area where all the different governments of the islands of Ireland and Britain can come together to work on issues like the North-South Ministerial Council, which affect them all. One big example is it allowed cooperation on issues which affect them, for example, drugs. It makes sense to take a unified approach to drugs between Britain and Ireland, Ireland and Northern Ireland, England, Scotland and Wales, because all those countries are affected by it, and the drugs coming in to one country normally affect all the other countries around them. So it's just agreement on issues that affect all of them. It's nice and short and sweet. If you're struggling to understand it, if you know what's on this slide, you'll be fine. There are some other key terms of the Good Friday Agreement, though, that come away from just the different ways that Northern Ireland will be governed through its normal devolved government inside Northern Ireland, its North-South Ministerial Council between North and South of Ireland, and also the British-Irish Council between the countries in Britain and Ireland. There are some other key terms. One big one is, as has often been promised, the Irish government agreed to remove Articles 2 and 3 of its constitution. And we know that those have been deeply unpopular for a long time because from the moment that the Irish Constitution was agreed, it claimed the territory of Northern Ireland as being Irish territory, as being Irish soil. And so this is a real strong reassurance for unionists that the Irish government is only committed to peaceful unity and not to claim Northern Ireland as being part of Ireland. Okay, they understand that Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom and will continue to be so. The British government then replaced its old Government of Ireland Act from 1920 with a new Northern Ireland Act of 1998. Remember, an Act of Parliament is just a law. So the law that was created in 1920 for the Government of Ireland has been replaced, specifically means the Government of Northern Ireland there, with a new Northern Ireland law set up in 1998, or passed in 1998. And another big thing is that policing was reformed. Chris Patten would lead a commission into reforming the RUC to make it acceptable for both communities. And this is a real strong point that was introduced for Republicans in particular. Republicans were very concerned about, and nationalists in general have, as we know, for a long time been concerned about the RUC and whether or not it's actually a fair policing force. They thought that it treated them in an unfair fashion. And so this report or commission that is set up, led by Chris Patton, is going to look at the RUC and say, how can we make it more welcoming for nationalists and unionists to make sure it has the support of both. And he comes up with a really important point that isn't true anymore, but was true at the time for a long time. He concluded that the RUC should be recruiting 50-50 Catholics and Protestants. So what that meant is that of all new recruits to the RUC, 50% would have to be Catholics from Northern Ireland, 50% would have to be Protestants from Northern Ireland. You couldn't have 70% of new recruits being Protestant and only 30% being Catholic. And the reason they introduced that is because there wasn't many Catholics in the RUC at the time, and they want to get more Catholics into the RUC. And they believe if they bring more Catholics into the police force, then eventually over time it will win the support of Catholics and they will trust the organisation. And another big way that they then help Catholics to begin to trust the RUC is they rename it. And instead of being called the Royal Ulster Constabulary, it is going to be known as the Police Service of Northern Ireland, the PSNI, as it is still known today. So they changed the name of it. They don't, get rid of it altogether and abolish it. They just rename it to the Police Service of Northern Ireland. And they introduced lots of changes to try and make it appeal to Catholics so they can win support of Catholics for this new police force. The last big term of the Good Friday Agreement, and one that's really easy to remember, and it's perhaps the most interesting of all of them, is prisoner release. So it is agreed under the Good Friday Agreement, paramilitary prisoners would be given early release. So they wouldn't have to see out their full time in jail. That's members of the Provisional IRA, the official IRA that was around before it went on ceasefire, other Republican paramilitaries, loyalist paramilitaries like the UDA and the UVF. All of or most of those paramilitary prisoners would be able to get early release to set about normalising society and actually moving and looking forward into the future. Prisoners were released on licence, which essentially means if they committed another crime, they would go back to prison and serve out their term. But they were released in the hope that they could go about this new Northern Ireland with a fresh start, essentially. This, and again, it's a bit more detail there. This meant that they committed another offence, they would return for their full sentence. You can see here one example of a prisoner being released under the Good Friday Agreement. I believe actually this is Patrick Magee. Patrick Magee, you may remember, was the Brighton bomber, the man who bombed the Conservative Party conference at Brighton's Grand Hotel and almost killed Margaret Thatcher. So these people are going to be set free. It's a very contentious, and by that I mean it's a very divisive part of the Good Friday Agreement. And I must actually at this moment take a bit of a moment to pause and actually pay homage to the efforts of yes, the Ulster Unionist Party, but in particular David Trimble. This was something that was unpopular with many people in Northern Ireland, but very unpopular in particular with the Unionist community, and particularly with the more hardline Loyalist community. This was the thing that really Ian Paisley could not accept. This was the bitter pill he couldn't swallow. But the fact that, David Trimble, as leader of the Ulster Unionists, was able to persuade Unionists to vote for this agreement, even though they knew members of, yes, of course, loyalist paramilitaries, but members of, in particular, the Provisional IRA would be set free early, is really a credit to his role in the peace talks, because it was very divisive and people still debate it to this day. So it is a really important part of the Good Friday Agreement, and it's definitely one worth remembering. So this next bit is reactions to the Good Friday Agreement. This came up on the 2025 paper, so if you're watching this ahead of the summer 2026 exam, it's unlikely to come up as a name marker, but as I've said, could come up in another capacity. The first sort of area we'll look at then is unionist reactions, in particular the UUP. The UUP, as we know, were the biggest unionist party, and they were most of all, the unionist parties the most behind the agreement, because they were what's referred to as the chief architects. They and the SDLP, yes, all political parties, I should say, in Northern Ireland agreed to this, but the UUP and the SDLP, as the biggest unionist and nationalist party, had a lot of say. And the fact that, they were a big chief negotiator for unionism does lead to some issues because many unionists are against this Good Friday Agreement, particularly after that last slide you can see in terms of prisoner release. Unionists were deeply divided by the agreement. David Trimble and the UUP officially backed the agreement. As a political party, the Ulster Unionist Party was behind the agreement. They signed it. David Trimble, chief architect, he signed it. However, there were many UUP politicians who were unhappy with it. Okay, and some of the key unionist politicians in the Ulster Unionist Party would actually switch to Ian Paisley's DUP out of anger. Two big examples are two former First Ministers for Northern Ireland, Arlene Foster and Jeffrey Donaldson. These two people were unionists. They were members of the Ulster Unionist Party, but they were so unhappy with the agreement that they weren't willing to accept it. And as their party supported it, they switched to the DUP instead. Okay, there's Jeffrey Donaldson there. There's Arlene Foster. They are two big figures in unionism in more recent years, and that's a really important one in terms of reactions within the UUP. Despite the fact the UUP supports it, some of their own politicians don't, and they actually leave the party and switch to the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party. The next area of unionist reactions would be the Ulster Unionist Campaign. The DUP, as you know, were deeply opposed to the Good Friday Agreement, led by Ian Paisley. They were never going to be willing in 1998 to accept this agreement because of the inclusion of Sinn Féin, and particularly because of the release of paramilitary prisoners. Paisley actually held a protest at Stormont in the hours before the agreement was signed. So he's outside Stormont Castle along with his supporters, and they are stopped from entering by the RUC, but they're outside with placards, big signs protesting against the agreement as it is about to be signed. Really, the reason that the unionists are so concerned about it is because of prisoner release, as I've said, decommissioning and reform of the RUC. So many unionists are unhappy with decommissioning because they don't think, this agreement should have gone ahead without the IRA first giving up their guns. And in 1998, when the agreement was signed, the IRA still has many of its weapons, and many unionists are worried about that. Prisoner release speaks for itself. They don't like the idea of IRA prisoners or any prisoners being released for their role in what they would say is terrorist activities throughout the entirety of the conflict. And reform of the RUC is a big sticking point as well. Many unions see this almost being as an admission that the RUC was wrong by having to rename it and having to change it and bringing that 50-50 recruitment, etc. They're saying this is disrespect to RUC officers who died during the conflict trying to protect people in Northern Ireland. So that's one big reason they are against this Good Friday Agreement. They actually then set up a campaign, particularly the DUP and the UKUP, the two political parties that walked away from the Good Friday Agreement talks or the peace talks when Sinn Féin was included in 1997, and they come up with an Ulster Unionist campaign along with some angry members of the UUP to fight against the agreement and persuade people not to vote for it. And they have a slogan which is "It's right to say no." You can actually see a DUP poster on the right hand side of the screen saying it's right in this referendum that's coming up to say no, do not accept this agreement, vote against it and prevent it from becoming law. We'll now look at nationalist reactions, and of course the two big ones we're going to talk about are the SDLP and of course Sinn Féin. On the 30th of April 1998, the IRA announced it wouldn't decommission as the agreement didn't go far enough. This is a concern for those trying to get the agreement across the line. So it's already been saying, 20 days after it's been saying, they say we're not giving up our weapons. This agreement doesn't go far enough. We need to go further before we give up our weapons. In May 1998, however, Sinn Féin's leadership advised its members of its party to support the agreement at its Ardèche, which they did. So this Ardèche is just essentially a special party conference where members were all invited to come down and vote on whether or not Sinn Féin should support this agreement, because of course Adams and McGuinness had signed it and were part of it, and the Ardèche does agree. I mean, if it helps you remember Ardfesh there, you can see how it's spelled. But essentially, Sinn Féin has a special conference and its members agree in May 1998 to support the party in backing this Good Friday Agreement, which had been agreed. Sinn Féin then begins to switch. Instead, it no longer views Stormont, as we had previously seen, as a partitionist parliament. It's no longer against it. In fact, it's going to get involved. It's going to be part of the Northern Ireland Assembly. And if they get seats, which eventually they do, enough to allow them under the government, they will take part in the Northern Ireland executive. So here we have a massive U-turn from Sinn Féin, from previously being a political party that was completely against standing on elections in Northern Ireland, to actually taking part in government in Northern Ireland with unionists as well. And I should say, although they're a bit slow to do so, eventually Sinn Féin fully commits to supporting the police, and that's in 2007. They finally fully commit to supporting the police service of Northern Ireland, and they continue to have the support for the police service today, something which was never true of Sinn Féin and the RUC. I think it's actually important just to show you how strongly Sinn Féin have supported the agreement, because they benefit from it quite a bit. You can see them standing here with on the steps of Stormont with a giant cover, a copy of the cover of the Good Friday Agreement, and you can see key Sinn Féin figures, in particular in the back right there. You can see Gerry Adams, the president of Sinn Féin, or former president of Sinn Féin, I should say. They actually, they continue to strongly support it, and they're willing to boast about how much they support this agreement to this very day. However, despite the fact that this agreement has been agreed by the political parties and by the British and Irish governments, it means nothing without the support of the people of Northern Ireland. And as a result, referendums were held, which would see whether or not people in Northern Ireland actually supported this Good Friday Agreement. There was actually 2 referendums that ran side by side. One in Northern Ireland, which was just, do we accept the agreement, yes or no? And one in the Republic of Ireland that was slightly different. And I'll explain that in a bit more detail in a second. So on the 22nd of May 1998, 2 referendums were held north and south of the Irish border. Northern Ireland, it's just simple, do we accept the Good Friday Agreement, yes or no? The Republic of Ireland, their agreement is not on the Good Friday, referendum, their vote is not on the Good Friday Agreement itself. It's on whether or not they should agree to the Irish government's promise to amend or change the Irish Constitution to remove Articles 2 and 3. So the Irish government have said, of course, as we know in the agreement, we will get rid of Articles 2 and 3, laying claim to Northern Ireland as Irish soil, but they need to get the support of the people in the Republic of Ireland in order to actually do that legally. Both are successful, I should point out. In Northern Ireland, 71% or 71.12% to be precise, of people accepted the Good Friday Agreement. 97% of nationalists voted yes. 52% of unionists voted yes. So what you can see there is you've got more than 50% of both nationalists and unionists, but I think it's very clear to see here there is much less support for the Good Friday Agreement amongst unionists because of concerns over things like policing, reform in the RUC, because of concerns over things like the inclusion of Sinn Féin, but also decommissioning and things like that, and prisoner release, of course. In the Republic of Ireland, 94% of people agreed to remove Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution, therefore allowing the Irish government to hold up their promise to remove those articles as part of the agreement. This is then just a sort of table showing you the list of parties who were in favour of the Good Friday Agreement and those who were against the Good Friday Agreement. All main political parties in the United Kingdom and in the Republic of Ireland supported this. The Labour Party supported it in Britain, the Conservative Party supported it, the Liberal Democrats, and so on. They all were behind this agreement. In the Republic of Ireland, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, they were all behind this agreement. The Labour Party of Ireland, they all supported this agreement. In Northern Ireland, you can see the list of all the parties that supported it. So you have the SDLP, of course, because they were one of the chief architects, they signed the agreement, the biggest nationalist party. The Ulster Unionist Party, of course, agreed to it. Although they were divided on it, officially the party accepted it, as did its leader, David Trimble, who had to sign it. Sinn Féin then, of course, are behind this agreement, as we've talked about earlier on. Another party at the time, the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, doesn't exist anymore. But it was very much a strong voice in supporting it, as was the Progressive Unionist Party, the Ulster Democratic Party, and the Alliance Party, who are, of course, neither Catholic nor Protestant, neither British nor Irish, but more about building an alliance. On the opposite side, we have one big political party that's against it and another minor party, the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, and the UK Unionist Party. Both were against the agreement. in terms of how this is impacted today, and this is literally the last slide you'll look at for the entire of Northern Ireland and the entire of Year 11 GCSE history, so long as you're revising ahead of this test to make sure that you don't have to repeat next year. The agreement allowed for Northern Ireland to once again have devolved government, so Northern Ireland can once again have its own government in charge, which hadn't been the case since 1972 when direct rule was introduced. 80 out of 108 seats in the new Northern Ireland Assembly actually went to pro-agreement parties. So that shows you the level of support and commitment there is across Northern Ireland. Overwhelming majority of seats, one in the new 108 seat Assembly, were by parties who supported the Good Friday Agreement. David Trimble, the Ulster Unionist Party leader, became the first Minister of Northern Ireland because the UUP, unionism rather I should say, was the biggest bloc. There were more unionist politicians than any other nationalist politicians, and as a result, David Trimble, as the leader of the biggest unionist party, became Northern Ireland's new First Minister. Seamus Mallon then, the SDLP deputy leader, became the deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, as the nationalist bloc was, all the nationalists together were the second biggest group after unionists, and therefore the biggest nationalist party, the SDLP, was allowed to appoint the deputy First Minister, and they did, and that was Seamus Mallon. Both the First Minister and Deputy First Minister have equal power. It's just to show you which one is from the bigger group, and in this case it was David Trimble from the Unionist groups. John Allardyce then was from the Alliance Party, and he became the presiding officer, the Speaker. So he was seen as being neutral because he was from the Alliance Party, neither Catholic nor Protestant, neither British nor Irish, and so he was appointed as to the role of Speaker in order to try and be very fair and give equal time to